We have been warned about planetary warming for a very long time. The mechanism underlying planetary warming has been understood since John Tyndall's 1863 lecture, which he subsequently published in his 1872 book. And he describes it this way. Quote, "Thus the atmosphere admits of the entrance of the solar heat, but checks its exit, and the result is a tendency to accumulate heat at the surface of the planet." End quote. One could argue that George Perkins Marsh, American ambassador and naturalist, had this greenhouse gas effect figured out for several years before Tyndall came along. At a presentation delivered before the Agricultural Society of Rutland County on September 30th, 1847, Marsh said, quote, "The mean temperature of London is a degree or two higher than that of the surrounding country, and Pallas believed that the climate of even so thinly a peopled country as Russia was sensibly modified by similar causes." And by Pallas, he's referring to the German scientist, a contemporary at the time. Fast forward to 1896, when Svante Arrhenius published the first peer-reviewed article predicting a substantial rise in global average temperature. Specifically, in April of 1896, Svante Arrhenius published in the Philosophical Magazine and Journal of Science, and in that paper predicted a 1 degree Celsius global average temperature increase by the year 2000. In fact, the global average temperature at the time was 0.76 degrees warmer than the 1750 baseline. So Arrhenius missed the prediction by only 0.24 degrees Celsius. Not bad that far in advance. And Arrhenius was wise enough to make sure that the prediction became true or false long after he died. Guy Callender published in the Quarterly Review of the Royal Meteorological Society in February 1938 a hand-drawn graph indicating temperature variations on Earth going back to 1880, and you can see quite a significant rise in global average temperature. You can also detect significant variation in readings of global average temperature over time. Life magazine ran an advertisement from Humble Oil. Humble would go on to become ExxonMobil. This from February 2nd, 1962. And the bragging in the first line of the advertisement says, "Each day Humble supplies enough energy to melt 7 million tons of glacier," with a very exciting exclamation mark tacked on to the end of that statement. Then we go to the United States President Richard Nixon on September 17th, 1969, in a memorandum to John Ehrlichman, in which he described the carbon dioxide problem with his emphasis, with an underline, he writes very clearly, is a problem, and perhaps most particularly is one that can seize the imagination of persons normally indifferent to projects of apocalyptic change. So in this memorandum, Nixon was writing about apocalyptic change in the not-too-distant future with respect to the greenhouse gas effect. Nixon also indicated that he understood global dimming, or the aerosol masking effect, when he writes, "It is entirely possible that there will be countervailing effects. For example, an increase of dust in the atmosphere would tend to lower temperatures and might offset the CO2 effect." So that's an interesting observation that Nixon in 1969 knew about the aerosol masking effect. In the 1980s, Al Gore, Carl Sagan, and James Hansen all testified before the United States Congress about the importance of near-term rises in global average temperature as a consequence of the greenhouse effect. As a result, in other words, of those greenhouse gases we are spewing into the atmosphere. Notice that according to NOAA data, that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association of the United States, the last below average temperature for any month was in February of 1985. Since February of 1985, each month has demonstrated an above average temperature. From the Associated Press, June 29, 1989, Noel Brown, director of the New York office of the United Nations Environment Program, said governments have a 10-year window of opportunity to solve the greenhouse effect before it goes beyond human control. This is published by the Associated Press, and so it clearly appeared in every major newspaper in the United States. 16 months later, the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases writes in a report, quote, "Beyond 1 degree C may elicit rapid, unpredictable, and nonlinear responses that could lead to extensive ecosystem damage," end quote. And with this line, the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases illustrates that they understand the importance of rapid, unpredictable, and nonlinear responses. This is not just a linear effect, and also that it could lead to extensive ecosystem damage. In other words, the United Nations Advisory Group on Greenhouse Gases understood in October of 1990 that planetary warming could well lead to extensive ecosystem damage, and we depend upon those ecosystems for our own survival. Along comes Time magazine with a special report on global warming on April 3rd, 2006. The cover title, "Be Worried, Be Very Worried." Finally, many years after Humble Oil made their bragging statement about melting ice, the CEO of ExxonMobil, which grew out of Humble Oil, admits that climate change is a top priority, this in Natural Gas Intelligence on May 28, 2014. With respect to those self-reinforcing feedback loops triggered at 1 degree C, David Spratt, climate writer and speaker, said in October 2014 that those self-reinforcing feedback loops probably were triggered at or below 0.5 degrees Celsius, above the 1750 baseline. The warnings keep coming. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, said on September 10, 2018, quote, "World has until 2020 to change course in order to avoid runaway climate change." The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change writes on October 8, 2018, quote, "With clear benefits to people and natural ecosystems, limiting global warming to 1.5 C compared to 2 C could go hand in hand with ensuring a more sustainable and equitable society," end quote. And they are referring here to 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees above the 1750 baseline. Turning to the peer-reviewed literature with a focus on vertebrates and mammals, because humans are vertebrate mammals, in a June 26, 2013 paper in Ecology Letters, Quintero and Wiens described climatic changes on niche evolution. And they write specifically, quote, "Our results are striking. Matching projected changes for 2100 would require rates of niche evolution that are more than 10,000 times faster than rates typically observed among species." They're referring to the 2100 date used by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, indicating here that they are adopting a very slow rate of climate change and still concluding that vertebrates cannot keep up by a factor of more than 10,000 times. On October 30th, 2018, Davis and colleagues wrote in a paper published in the peer-reviewed Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, quote, "We use a birth-death tree framework to show that even if extinction rates slow to pre-anthropogenic background levels, recovery will likely take millions of years," end quote. In other words, even if by some miracle extinction rates slow to pre-human background levels, the recovery of mammals still will take millions of years. So here we have the rates of change outstripping the ability of vertebrates and mammals to keep up. And as humans, and therefore as vertebrate mammals, we should be concerned. We're in the midst of a mass extinction event, first reported to my knowledge in the peer-reviewed literature in Science Advances in June of 2015 by conservation biologist Gerardo Ceballos and colleagues. They go on with a couple of papers subsequently, most recently on June 16th of 2020, in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, indicating that vertebrates are on the brink. Specifically, quote, the ongoing sixth mass extinction may be the most serious environmental threat to the persistence of civilization because it is irreversible and accelerating, end quote. Now we know, of course, that we're in the midst of at least the eighth mass extinction event. And speaking of mass extinction events, according to the United Nations Environment Program, in August 2010, we are driving some 150 to 200 species to extinction every single day. That's the estimate that was come up with by the United Nations Environment Program more than 10 years ago. In their November 13th, 2018 paper, Strona and Bradshaw indicated that co-extinctions are in the process of annihilating planetary life. This in an open access paper published in Scientific Reports, November 2018. And the following day, more or less coincident with the release of the paper, Australia's SBS News quotes the first author of the paper, Strona, quote, our paper demonstrates that even the most tolerant species ultimately succumb to extinction when the less tolerant species on which they depend disappear. In other words, that's the idea of co-extinctions. If a species that we depend upon goes extinct, then we will certainly go extinct as well. As it turns out, humans depend upon many, many species for our own survival. Finally, in September of 2019, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change concludes that climate change is irreversible, specifically due to heating of the oceans. I want to back up just a minute and talk about habitat, what it means, and why it's important for Homo sapiens as well as other organisms on Earth. The best short definition I can find is from Linnea Hall and colleagues, published in 1997 in the peer-reviewed journal Wildlife Society Bulletin. And they write, the resources and conditions present in an area that produce occupancy, including survival and reproduction, by a given organism. That's what habitat is. It's everything that an organism needs to survive and reproduce. Inconveniently, the European Strategy and Policy Analysis System published a major synthetic paper in April of 2019. In the paper, it is reported, quote, an increase of 1.5 degrees is the maximum the planet can tolerate. Should temperatures increase further, we will face even more droughts, floods, extreme heat, and poverty, and at worst, the extinction of humankind altogether. So this paper, authored by Gaub and colleagues, indicates that the extinction of humankind altogether is likely to occur at 1.5 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline. How inconvenient, then, that according to writer Sam Carana at the Arctic News blog, we have already crossed the 2 degrees Celsius above the 1750 baseline. And this should not come as a big surprise. All of these warnings through history have been met with a demand, a great desire by the populace to keep the set of living arrangements known as a heat engine operating. And so, of course, we have continued to heat the planet. But what does it mean to lose habitat for Homo sapiens? Well, as it turns out, we depend upon other organisms for our own survival, many of them, in fact, for clean water and healthy food. Sam Sett and colleagues, in a paper published in Nature Communications, July 7, 2020, concluded, quote, the inertia and internal variability of the climate system, however, will delay the emergence of a discernible response even to strong, sustained mitigation. Yes, even strong, sustained mitigation will likely be insufficient to produce a significant decline or stabilization of global average temperature. A subsequent paper published in Scientific Reports on November 12, 2020, by Randers and Goluke, indicates, quote, the world is already past a point of no return for global warming. Emphasis is found in the original paper. That paper in Scientific Reports indicates that the first climate tipping point is already in the past, and in fact points to 3 self-reinforcing feedback loops that we have already passed. Climate scientists have long known that a warmer world is a wetter world. That concept is borne out by a paper published in Science Advances on May 8, 2020. The paper by Colin Raymond and colleagues, titled The Emergence of Heat and Humidity Too Severe for Human Tolerance, indicates that we have passed the lethal conditions for heat and humidity at various places around the globe already. Could geoengineering rescue us? A major synthesis produced by the United States National Academy of Sciences and released on February 10, 2015, indicates no, geoengineering will not preserve habitat for humans on Earth. Just a few months later, a major synthetic work produced by the European Transdisciplinary Assessment of Climate Engineering results the same conclusion, that we are too far down the road of planetary overheating to preserve habitat for human animals on this particular planet. It's not a conclusion I am happy about. It brings me no joy to see the extinction of humans. And the follow-up, obviously, is the extinction of all life on Earth as a result of 2 factors: abrupt heating associated with loss of aerosol masking when Homo sapiens disappear, and also due to the catastrophic meltdown of the world's nuclear power facilities, which will certainly cause loss of habitat for essentially every species on Earth, and probably the combination of those 2, rapid overheating of the Earth and immersion in ionizing radiation, will be sufficient to remove life from the entirety of this planet.